This is He Who Moans, Doctor Who reviews. I only complain because I like Doctor Who and I care. And I overanalyze too much because, whatever, it's just my opinion. So here we are, 2005, and Paul McGann wasn't the current Doctor anymore, and Bigfinish were heavily wanting to capitalise on the new intake of listeners that they might get off the back of the new series, and so the Divergent arc was cut short, and now the 8th Doctor audios came on random months like the other plays in their monthly series, and were a bit more conventional. I was a bit disappointed at first. Despite the Divergent saga ending up a bit of an underperformer, not much of one, I enjoyed much more than I didn't, but I was really hoping for more stuff like Scherzo and Natural History of Fear. But still, while the next bunch of stories are a little bit patchy, there's a fair few here that I'd highly recommend, and a couple of favourites of mine. The cliffhanger at the end of the next life, seeing the Doctor, Charlie and Karissas finally escaping the Divergent universe, leads into Terra Firma, and sees them taken prisoner by Davros and the Daleks. Wow, never heard that one before. And then a chicken crosses a road, and a man goes to the Doctor and says, "Help me, I think I'm a pair of curtains." But then about halfway through the story, something happens, and I'm not going to say what, but the twist is about 80 times more out of left field than most of the Divergent saga. What I love about Terra Firma is the setup is incredibly conventional. Daleks have subjugated a planet, and it's mostly focused on a small area of that planet resistant to the occupation, who are quite blasé about the whole thing and hold evening parties. And if you describe most of the general sort of events that happen in Terra Firma from start to finish, it'll sort of just blur into this haze of what you'd expect from a Dalek story, but it's just full of so many curveballs. To be an utterly pretentious hippie, I'd describe experiencing Terra Firma as like a conventional Dalek runaround in which you're tripping your fucking balls off. Although I wouldn't recommend it to newer listeners though, you can accuse it of being continuity porn, and I really wouldn't argue. It's pretty much there to pick up where Remembrance of the Daleks left off, going, "Oh yeah, didn't the Doctor blow up Skaro?" With Terra Firma, it does help to be in with the expanded universe already. As said, while a fun timey-wimey Dalek story in its own right, it is a massive mindfuck, and... okay, fuck it, that twist.
Spoilers!
Okay, so about halfway through the episode, two incidental characters get revealed to be former companions of the Doctor from before he met Charlie, and he had adventures with them prior to Storm Warning. Before the Doctor had his memories of their travels together erased by Davros, who uses Samson and Gemma in his plan to create a new army of Daleks which comes back to bite the Doctor in the arse in this one. Yeah, feel free to start lying on the floor, rocking back and forth, gibbering and crying, aspiring Doctor Who continuity guide writers. So much canon! Next up, we have the most highly slated 8th Doctor play, and one of the most highly slated in Bigfinish's catalogue. Scaredy Cat. I hate being so harsh on a Bigfinish play because I love them so much, but it just needs doing in this case. Scaredy Cat is a rather stale rehash of basic plot elements from the Twilight Kingdom, with a sack full of more general Doctor Who ideas piled on top. I'm not sure how many issues with Scaredy Cat are down to it being seriously rewritten after it was initially penned for a third series of Divergent Universe stories. Lots of it must have been cut out as it's only 75 minutes long, the shortest monthly series play ever, but given just how many ideas Scaredy Cat tries to play with, any more would probably just make the reason that it didn't work for me much worse. Its main problem is it's got about 5 ideas, but it can't seem to pick one and just stick with it. Like, let me read you everything that Scaredy Cat tries to do out loud. There's twin planets, one is populated, one has been deserted for millennia. On the deserted one, in a base in a jungle, some scientists are conducting experiments to remove evil tendencies from a criminal from the populated planet, whose motivations don't actually make any sense. It's just said that he is political. Whatever that adds to the plot. Meanwhile, the ghost of a dead little girl in the jungle takes people back in time to when there was a disaster that killed the population of the planet, and the criminal guy is given the power of ESP somehow, and wants to take over the populated world or something. And spoiler warning, it turns out that the planet is alive, which the Doctor figures out for very spurious reasons which aren't actually based on anything he's learnt. Seriously, the way that he reaches his conclusion is literally... well, why not? Which, okay, Paul McGann is one of the greats, but even he cannot sell that. Yet, Scaredy Cat's problem is its narrative device is entirely based on, and then another thing happened. I'm sure the writer had good intentions behind it, but the best word to sum it up would easily be messy. Other Lives is up next, and it's the first pure historical Bigfinish play that I heard, and I was really surprised how much I liked it. Bigfinish really get the pure historicals. They're a lot more interesting than you'd expect if you'd never really been into them before. This was the one that really got me into going back and re-examining them from my position of having primarily been a pulp sci-fi guy in my teens. Basically, Charlie, the Doctor and Karissas go to see the famous Great Exhibition, which, for the unaware and history-averse, think a sort of Victorian equivalent of the Millennium Dome. Okay, underselling it I know, but... Now come on, how's that not the basic gist of it? And each of them by accident end up forced into situations of having to give some sort of meaning to other people's lives for them. While some of Other Lives' plot twists are a little bit ludicrous for something supposedly grounded in reality, but it did play out its cliffhangers really well and kept you asking, how is the Doctor gonna get out of this? How is Charlie gonna get out of this? Oh my god, how the fuck is Karissas gonna get out of that? Because he ends up enslaved by a travelling freak show and sort of has an Elephant Man plot draped around him, which was the most fun that we ever had with Karissas. Well, fun... No, I'm not saying that being enslaved by a freak show is fun, it's just... In terms of a good story, it's fun, and just... God, fuck the English language sometimes. Just saying it makes a whole lot of sense to do a sort of Elephant Man style plot, considering you're bringing a weird chameleonic alien to London. I do highly recommend this one. It's a serial that really keeps you guessing. But yes, the ending is pretty lackluster based on what had happened up until that point. Hell, I just wanted it to continue. I'd had a lot of fun with Other Lives, and I thought the "oh, it's over now" resolution was kind of a letdown. But if you weren't too au fait with the pure historicals beforehand, I reckon Other Lives is a good one to try and change your mind. Next up we have Time Works, which is one of my favourite 8th Doctor audios. It's another one of the going full Alice in Wonderland concepts. It's set on a planet where its workers are run to a strict work schedule and are threatened with being taken out of time if they're unproductive and placed in an alternate universe, featuring totally unrelated clockwork robots to the ones from Girl in the Fireplace, which was broadcast 3 months after its release. Yes, pretty odd coincidence. Although the clockwork robots in Time Works are very different. They're a really menacing background presence in the dystopian society, and it makes a lot of sense thematically for them to run on clockwork, given it's all about society running, well, like clockwork. I just love Time Works' surreal and foreboding landscape. I'm a huge fan of Bigfinish's penchant for fashioning trippy, unimaginable worlds that you'd ideally need a sack full of money to visually realise, that with the right sound design combined with the listener's imagination, just become really visceral places that your mind can escape to. I personally think that Time Works is one of the most underrated plays in Bigfinish's catalogue, and I highly recommend it. Next up is Something Inside, and it's kind of unfortunate because the 8th Doctor plays appeared to be hitting their stride again. Basically, you remember Scaredy Cat's 8 ideas that it can't choose between? Well, Something Inside reappropriates one of them, the whole psychic power experiment to remove criminal tendencies, and it sticks it into a general base under siege story, and also failed with it, but it's got a bit of a tighter focus than Scaredy Cat. Or as it's commonly known, everything in the kitchen sink burning in a massive fire. The only real problem was that Something Inside just didn't end up being too noteworthy. The primary thing I noticed was it's set in a prison called The Cube, and it appeared on the surface to be an homage to Cube, a really underrated late 90s indie sci-fi horror, which I just so happen to be a huge fan of. Seriously, Cube's fucking great. Basically, it's a massive labyrinthine prison where the Doctor and co come across its inmates, a group of psychics considered by the outside world to be a danger to society, and they're being hunted by a massive amorphous entity called the Brainworm, which is a creature that eats people's minds. And it's not just Cube that it rips off, it also does the creature hides inside of people from John Carpenter's The Thing as well. I guess that might have been why I enjoyed Something Inside more than most people. I was playing Spot the classic horror movie reference point for most of it. It's not as bad as some people say it is, it pretty much just amounted to yet another base under siege tale, and it did keep me engaged throughout at the very least, but in the end its only real crime is being unremarkable. Memory Lane is next up, and it's the first play from Eddie Robson, who's another Bigfinish regular who I'd love to see with a new Who script one of these days. Memory Lane is one of the most solid debut stories from a Bigfinish writer, and unfortunately I can't say much about it without giving the game away, but let me just set the scene. Basically, the Doctor and co arrive in a street in 60s suburban England where every single house is an exact copy of each other, where a man who thinks he's a 10-year-old child is trapped in his childhood by malevolent ice cream men dressed in astronaut suits. I fucking love this one. Some people were complaining by this point that Bigfinish were just sort of going in a circle, just doing more weird, trippy landscapes every time, but they never started feeling samey to me. All the ones that I've talked about so far went for their own style. Kedroia was chirpy and whimsical, Timeworks was dark and foreboding, and Memory Lane fashioned a traditional Doctor Who-ish sci-fi adventure out of the Doctor and Co stumbling in on someone dreaming of his childhood. I love me some weird landscape stories, and Memory Lane is a great one. I will admit it does kinda go a bit south in its second half though, which I guess is always going to be the general problem if you've got such an enticing, mysterious setup as Memory Lane. If your hook's as good as this, more often than not, your actual explanations won't be. Though I do highly recommend this one as well. Unless of course you ran out of money by this point, as we're now on our 14th full price release, and they're really not getting any cheaper. The next one is Karissas' last, Absolution, and it's okay. This one's not well liked, and I do see why, as it's fairly unremarkable. Scott Woodard, who did a great job on I, Davros and the Juggernauts just to mention, spent a lot more time developing a sort of interesting story to go with Karissas' ending story, set on a planet full of traditionalist hell imagery. It's your general mishmash of hard fantasy and sci-fi, which is admirable and fairly well executed, but I had a Twilight Kingdom problem again. There was supposed to be some kind of arc there that I would have preferred if they'd done more stuff with Karissas in the background to his church in his ending story, as they'd been building it up throughout this run, and I thought that the final story was going to be this big climactic epic finale, but when we actually got here, he's barely in Absolution. When he was first introduced in Creed of Croman, after that we had vague hints of his backstory and that we'd get something more near the end of his story all the fucking time, and Absolution just didn't do any of that, which is probably what caused the mixed reception more than the story's inherent flaws. Whether you like Karissas or not, his backstory was much more interesting than what they actually did with it. We shouldn't have been waiting an hour and 45 minutes for anything to do with him, and for the result to just be, okay, that's Karissas' story over now, I guess, after all that they built up, and it just left me going, what the fuck, really? And I just forgot everything else that the story did. However, the last track of this massive waste of potential almost made it worth it, and to explain why requires a massive spoiler warning plastered all over the screen again. Spoiler warning. Okay, Karissas dies. I don't think I'm spoiling much there though. You pretty much guessed, if not when he left the Divergent Universe, but as the series progressed, that the only way out of the TARDIS was death. And when he does, the Doctor just says, right, fine, let's get back to normal, as we know he does. And Charlie, not knowing anything about how the Doctor has dealt with a companion departure before, is quite rightly horrified. She's been travelling with him for so long, not realising that the Doctor is hundreds of years old and has travelled with many people. Like, of course he'd be desensitised to them dying off by now. She knows this from Scherzo, but she's never actually seen it before, and now realises the Doctor is too wrapped up in himself to have actual feelings and human emotions along the same lines as hers, and with this epiphany she now sees all of the adventures that she's had with him in a new light. And from this, she concludes that she has to leave him. And it's really just astonishing. That track's really worth it, to be honest. There's so much dramatic weight crammed into those 3.5 minutes that's totally absent from the rest of the story. It's a bit like Kill the Moon in that respect. Oh, Christ. Does anyone else get horrific nightmare flashbacks whenever anyone mentions the name of the episode I just said? I mean, I may be just saying the ending was so good because I'd gone through everything Charlie had been in by this point and was heavily invested, but yeah, that last track just floors me. The Girl Who Never Was is the last of the original 8th Doctor adventures, and it was a really fitting send-off for Charlie that finds the balance that Absolution didn't have between story-specific ideas and the dramatic weight of the character arc. Well, Charlie being the stronger character probably helped. Ooh, well, no probably about it. The Doctor takes Charlie to Singapore in 1930, where they've decided to say goodbye, when Charlie is mixed up in one last mystery involving a ghost ship, and the pair of them get separated into 2 different times. Charlie's sent to 1942, while the Doctor's in 2008, where they each separately discover that the ship is part of a Cybermen strategy. Like with Terra Firma, when you say everything that happens about it out loud, it sounds like another traditional Cybermen runaround story, and while it's not as batshit as Terra Firma, it does have a fair few timey-wimey elements to it, which actually play out in a surprisingly unconvoluted way. While Bigfinish's handling of timey-wimey plots can be convoluted at times, the way in which events in Girl Who Never Was flow together between one scene with Charlie in 1942 and the Doctor in 2008, unfurling our plot bit by bit, works really well. Another strength is, of course, its heavy emphasis on Charlie's character arc that they desperately needed if they had any hope of Karissas' one actually working. By placing Charlie in a situation without the Doctor, in which she has to put everything that she's learnt in her travels into practice. And India Fisher gives a great performance for the occasion. Of course, I was already heavily invested in Charlie, but the way this one works, giving equal diligence to the companion and the Doctor, makes it a great example of the type of story that I would argue every good companion should have at least one of, and as such is the complete and total antithesis of Absolution. And the ending is just superb. The way that Charlie leaves the Doctor and how the Doctor reacts to it fits really well with their characters and how the series had ended up by this point, and offers decent closure to their relationship. It's the kind of satisfying companion departure that so few of them have actually been. It's a little bit undercut since Charlie then goes on to travel with the 6th Doctor after this for a few releases, but within the context of itself it works really well, and since her goodbye from the 6th Doctor was just as well handled, if not more so, I think I'm just always going to end up giving a story with a lot of focus on Charlie a big thumbs up. And so we end the 8th Doctor's first era. It was long, weird, didn't make a whole lot of sense in many places, and has its fair share of problems, but I ultimately thought it was highly worth it on the whole, and when it hits, I'd call it my favourite realm of Doctor Who canon. See, I can be critical of my favourite realm of Doctor Who canon.